I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sitting in a quiet room after a long day. Maybe you're driving home with a child sleeping beside you. Or maybe you've just felt invisible in a world that never thanks you. Rosa Martinez had given her entire soul to children who weren't hers. One October night, she would scream so desperately that the sound would shatter 10 years of silence. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart. The autumn wind whistled through the towering glass buildings of downtown Chicago, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of Lake Michigan. In the prestigious Gold Coast neighborhood, where million-dollar condominiums stretched toward the sky like fingers grasping at clouds, Rosa Martinez walked slowly up the marble steps of the Whitman mansion. Her worn leather purse hung from her shoulder, containing nothing more than a few crumpled dollar bills, a faded photograph of a baby boy who never lived to see his first birthday, and a rosary blessed by the priest at St. Augustine's in her humble Pilsen neighborhood. Rosa's hands told the story of 5 decades lived in service to others. The calluses on her palms spoke of countless loads of laundry folded with care, of floors scrubbed until they gleamed, of bottles warmed at 3 in the morning when the world slept in peace. Her fingertips bore tiny scars from years of cooking, sewing, mending not just clothes, but hearts that had been broken by absent parents and cold boarding school dormitories. These were hands that had learned to love without expecting anything in return, hands that had dried more tears than they had ever shed for themselves. The Whitman mansion stood like a monument to success, its limestone facade gleaming under the afternoon sun. Charles Whitman had built his fortune from nothing, transforming a small construction company inherited from his father into a real estate empire worth over $200 million. His investment portfolio included properties from Miami to Seattle, stocks that generated dividends of 6 figures monthly, and even a modest but growing collection of Bitcoin that his financial advisor had recommended. Every room in the house whispered of wealth. Persian rugs that cost more than most people's annual salaries, crystal chandeliers imported from Austria, and oil paintings whose insurance value alone could have fed a family for decades. But wealth, Rosa had learned during her first months working there, could not fill the silence that echoed through those opulent halls. Charles Whitman was a widower, his wife Margaret having died of cancer 3 years earlier, leaving behind twin children who were barely 4 years old. Jason and Emily Whitman had inherited their father's penetrating gray eyes and their mother's delicate bone structure, but they had also inherited something far heavier, the profound loneliness that comes from losing a mother before you're old enough to understand what forever means. Rosa remembered the day Charles hired her with the same clarity with which she remembered her son Miguel's funeral. It had been a Tuesday morning in September, and she had taken 2 buses from her small apartment on 18th Street to reach the mansion. The employment agency had warned her that Mr. Whitman was demanding, that several nannies before her had quit within months, unable to handle not just the children's grief, but the father's emotional distance. "He pays well," the agency director had said, "but don't expect warmth. This man has built walls around his heart that seem impenetrable." When Rosa first saw Jason and Emily, they were sitting on the floor of their enormous playroom, surrounded by toys that cost more than her monthly rent, but playing listlessly with simple wooden blocks. Jason, always the more reserved of the twins, barely looked up when she entered. Emily, with her wild curls and defiant chin, stared at Rosa with the kind of suspicion that only comes from having been disappointed by too many adults who promise to stay but inevitably leave. "You're not our mama," Emily had announced on that first day, her small voice carrying the weight of a truth that hurt more than any tantrum could have. "No, mi amor," Rosa had replied gently, kneeling down to the child's eye level. "I'm not your mama, but I'm here to take care of you, and I'm not going anywhere." It was a promise she made without knowing how prophetic those words would become, how they would be tested by years of being treated as invisible furniture, how they would sustain her through moments when her own heart threatened to break from the weight of unrequited love. Charles Whitman had made his expectations clear from the beginning. Rosa was to care for the children's physical needs, maintain their schedules, ensure they were properly fed and clean, and prepared for their expensive private school each morning. She was not to form emotional attachments. She was not to assume any parental authority. She was, in his words, a professional caregiver, nothing more. "The children have had enough disruption in their lives," he had told her that first day, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding boardrooms and negotiating million-dollar deals. "They don't need another temporary mother figure who will eventually leave. They need stability, routine, and professional care. Can you provide that, Miss Martinez?" Rosa had nodded, though something deep in her chest had twisted at his words. She understood his logic, even respected his desire to protect his children from further loss, but she also understood something he didn't, that love, real love, doesn't ask permission before it takes root. It grows quietly, in the spaces between words, in the gentle touch that soothes a nightmare, in the patient voice that explains why the sky is blue and why some people go to heaven before we're ready to let them go. The first few months were the hardest. Jason and Emily tested her with the intensity that only grieving children can muster. They hid from her, refused to eat the meals she prepared, screamed for their father when he was at the office making deals that would add another few million to his already substantial net worth. Emily, particularly, seemed determined to prove that Rosa was just another temporary fixture in their lives, someone who would eventually grow tired of their pain and leave them behind. But Rosa had learned patience in the hardest school of all: loss. When her son Miguel had been born, the doctors had given her 3 days with him before a congenital heart condition took him back to heaven. 3 days of holding him, of memorizing the curve of his tiny fingers, of singing lullabies in Spanish that her own mother had sung to her in their small apartment in Guadalajara. 3 days that had to last a lifetime, that had carved a hollow space in her heart where love lived without an object to hold it. When Miguel died, Rosa had thought her capacity for love had died with him. But children, she discovered, have a way of calling forth love from places you didn't even know existed. Slowly, carefully, she began to build bridges to Jason and Emily's hearts. She learned that Jason loved stories about dragons and knights, that he would sit perfectly still if she braided friendship bracelets while she talked. She discovered that Emily's defiance melted away when Rosa brushed her hair gently, humming old Mexican folk songs that seemed to soothe something wild and hurt inside the little girl. The house began to change around them. Rosa's presence brought warmth to spaces that had felt cold since Margaret's death. The kitchen, once a sterile place where a professional cook prepared meals according to strict nutritional guidelines, became a place where laughter bubbled up like water from a spring. Rosa taught the children to roll empanadas, their small hands dusted with flour as they worked beside her. She showed them how to make hot chocolate the way her grandmother had taught her, with cinnamon and a touch of vanilla that made the whole house smell like love. But Charles Whitman noticed these changes with something closer to alarm than gratitude. One evening, he found Rosa and the children in the kitchen, Emily on her lap while Jason stood beside her chair, all 3 of them looking through a picture book of Mexican folktales that Rosa had brought from home. The scene was so natural, so tender, that for a moment Charles felt something crack in the wall he had built around his heart. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice cutting through their laughter like a blade through silk, "I need to speak with you." They met in his study, a room that smelled of leather and expensive whiskey, where the walls were lined with books about business strategy and financial planning that no one but Charles ever touched. His desk was mahogany, imported from somewhere tropical and exotic, and covered with documents that represented millions of dollars in real estate transactions. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Lake Michigan that real estate agents valued at over $50,000 per year, just for the privilege of seeing it. "The children seem to be growing attached to you," Charles said without preamble, not looking up from the contract he was reviewing. "I want to remind you that your position here is temporary. The children's mother left them a substantial inheritance, managed in trust until they reach adulthood. When they're old enough for boarding school, probably in a few years, your services will no longer be needed. I don't want them to be hurt again when that time comes." Rosa felt each word like a physical blow, but she kept her voice steady when she responded. "Mr. Whitman, I understand that you want to protect them, but children need love to grow, not just food and shelter." "Love," he repeated, finally looking up at her with those gray eyes that could have been carved from stone, "is a luxury that comes with a price I'm not willing to let them pay again. They loved their mother, Miss Martinez. Look what that love cost them." It was a conversation that would replay in Rosa's mind hundreds of times over the years that followed. She began to understand that Charles Whitman wasn't just protecting his children from loss, he was protecting himself. His fear of loving and losing again had turned him into a man who preferred the cold comfort of financial security to the terrifying vulnerability of emotional connection. His wealth was his fortress, his business success his armor, and his children were investments to be managed rather than hearts to be nurtured. But Rosa also knew something that Charles had forgotten. Love isn't something you can control like stock options or real estate portfolios. It doesn't follow market trends or respond to strategic planning. Love grows in its own season, at its own pace, and it endures long after the people who tried to contain it have moved on. As the months turned to years, Rosa became the invisible foundation upon which the Whitman household functioned. She was there when Jason woke up screaming from nightmares about his mother, holding him until the fears subsided and he could sleep again. She was there when Emily fell from her bike and scraped her knee, not just cleaning the wound, but kissing it better the way Margaret used to do. She was there for piano recitals and school plays, sitting in the back row because she wasn't family, but beaming with pride, as if the children on stage were her own flesh and blood. Charles maintained his emotional distance, but he couldn't help noticing how the house had changed since Rosa's arrival. There was laughter echoing from rooms that had been silent for years. The children, who had been pale and withdrawn, were now rosy-cheeked and filled with an energy that seemed to emanate from some deep well of security that Rosa had somehow tapped. They ran to greet her each morning when she arrived, chattering about their dreams and their plans for the day in a way they had never done with any of the previous nannies. But success in love, Rosa was learning, came with its own kind of pain. The more the children depended on her, the more invisible she seemed to become to the adult world around them. At school functions, she was introduced as the nanny, never by her name. When the children's friends came to play, their parents spoke around her as if she were a piece of furniture. Even the other household staff, the cook, the gardener, the housekeeper, maintained a professional distance that reminded Rosa daily that she was an employee, not a member of the family she was helping to heal. The loneliness was crushing sometimes. Rosa would lie in her small bedroom on the third floor of the mansion, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, and feel the weight of her invisible existence pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. She had given up her own apartment to live in the Whitman house full-time, had distanced herself from friends in her old neighborhood, had structured her entire life around the needs of children who loved her but couldn't claim her as their own. There were moments when she questioned her choices, when the accumulated small humiliations threatened to overwhelm her resolve. Like the time Emily's teacher assumed Rosa was the housekeeper and asked her to wait outside during a parent-teacher conference that Charles couldn't attend, or the afternoon when Jason's friend asked why his nanny wasn't white like everyone else's, and Rosa had to explain gently that families come in all colors while her heart broke at the casual cruelty of childhood innocence. But then there would be moments that reminded her why she stayed, why love was worth the price she paid for giving it. Like the morning Emily crawled into her bed during a thunderstorm, whispering, "Rosa, I'm scared," and falling asleep with her small hand curled in Rosa's palm. Or the evening Jason brought her a drawing he had made at school, a picture of their family that included Rosa standing right beside him and Emily, with the words, "My family," written in his careful 7-year-old handwriting across the top. These were the moments that sustained her, that filled the hollow place in her heart where Miguel's absence lived like a shadow. She began to understand that motherhood wasn't just about giving birth. It was about showing up day after day with patience and love and the kind of quiet strength that children instinctively recognize and trust. She was mothering Jason and Emily in ways their father couldn't, healing their grief with a love that asked for nothing in return except the privilege of being present for their growing. As the children moved through elementary school and into their pre-teen years, Rosa watched them change from broken, grieving toddlers into confident, caring young people. Jason developed a quiet dignity that reminded her of his father, but was tempered with an empathy that Charles had lost somewhere along the way. He was the child who noticed when Rosa looked tired, who brought her tea without being asked, who remembered her birthday even when his father forgot. Emily grew into a fierce, protective young woman who had inherited her mother's beauty, but also Rosa's capacity for nurturing others. She was the one who insisted Rosa sit with them during family movie nights, who asked Rosa to teach her to cook the Mexican dishes that had become their comfort food, who raged against her father's emotional distance with a passion that reminded Rosa of her younger self. But with adolescence came new challenges that tested Rosa's invisible position in ways she hadn't anticipated. The children began to notice the social dynamics that had always existed, but that their young eyes hadn't been trained to see. They started to question why Rosa ate in the kitchen while they dined in the formal dining room, why she couldn't attend their school events as their guardian, why their father never included her in family photographs. "It's not fair," Emily declared one afternoon when she was 13, her voice carrying the righteous indignation of youth. "You take care of us more than Daddy does, but he gets to be called our parent, and you don't get to be called anything." Rosa had held Emily while she cried angry tears about the injustice of their situation, but she had also tried to help the girl understand the complex realities of their world. "Mi amor," she had said gently, "love isn't always about titles or recognition. Sometimes the most important love is the kind that doesn't need a name." But privately, Rosa was struggling with her own growing resentment. 10 years of invisible service had taken their toll, and she found herself wondering what her life might have been if she had made different choices, if she had allowed herself to love someone who could love her back openly, without shame or social constraints. She was 58 years old, had never married, had given the best years of her life to children who were growing up and away from her with each passing day. The breaking point came on a cold March evening when Charles announced at dinner that he was considering sending Jason and Emily to boarding school in Connecticut. "It's one of the most prestigious preparatory schools in the country," he said, cutting his steak with the same mechanical precision he applied to business deals. "The education they'll receive there will prepare them for Ivy League universities, set them up for lives of success and influence." Rosa felt the words hit her like physical blows, but it was Emily's reaction that shattered something inside her chest. The girl pushed back from the table so violently that her chair toppled over, tears streaming down her face as she screamed, "You can't send us away. This is our home. Rosa is our family." "Rosa is our employee," Charles said coldly, his voice cutting through Emily's sobs like a blade through water. "And it's time you both learned the difference." That night, Rosa lay in her narrow bed listening to Emily's muffled crying from the room down the hall, and made a decision that had been building in her heart for months. She couldn't continue to love these children from the margins, couldn't continue to pour her soul into a situation that would ultimately demand her absence. If Charles was determined to send them away, perhaps it was time for her to reclaim her own life, to find a place where her love would be recognized rather than merely tolerated. She began making quiet preparations to leave, contacting the employment agency, looking at small apartments she could afford on the savings she had accumulated over the years. The irony wasn't lost on her that 10 years of caring for Millionaire's children had left her with barely enough money to rent a studio apartment in a neighborhood far from the Gold Coast elegance she had helped to maintain. But fate, Rosa was about to discover, had other plans entirely. Some stories change course not through careful planning, but through moments of crisis that reveal truths too powerful to ignore. And on an October evening that began like any other, Rose's decade of invisible love was about to explode into the kind of desperate scream that changes everything forever. The evening started with what should have been a routine pickup. Emily and Jason, now 15 and navigating the complex social waters of high school, had been invited to a party at the home of one of their classmates in nearby Evanston. Charles was in New York for a series of business meetings that could potentially add millions to his real estate portfolio, meetings too important to cancel for something as ordinary as teenage social obligations. Just bring them home by 11, he had instructed Rosa over the phone from his hotel room in Manhattan. And make sure they understand that this kind of social engagement is a privilege that can be revoked if their grades suffer. Rosa had nodded as if he could see her, though something in her chest tightened at the casual way he delegated what should have been a parental moment. These were the kinds of occasions that other parents treasured, the chance to meet their children's friends, to see them laughing and social and growing into the people they would become. But Charles treated them like business appointments, items to be efficiently managed rather than memories to be cherished. The party had been at the home of one of Jason's classmates, a boy whose father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships and whose mother collected art with the kind of casual wealth that made even the Whitman fortune seem modest. Rosa had dropped the twins off at 7, watching them walk up the circular driveway toward a house that glowed with warm light and echoed with teenage laughter. Emily had turned back to wave, her face bright with excitement, and Rosa had waved back from the car, her heart swelling with the kind of maternal pride that had no place in her official job description. The pickup at 11 had gone smoothly. Jason and Emily had piled into the back seat of the Mercedes sedan that Charles had designated for family transportation, chattering about the party, about who had been there, and what they had talked about and who might ask whom to the upcoming winter formal. Rosa had listened with half an ear, smiling at their excitement while navigating the quiet streets of the North Shore suburbs. It was Emily who noticed first that something was wrong with her brother. They were stopped at a red light on Sheridan Road, the lake visible through the bare trees as a sheet of black water reflecting the city lights, when Emily's cheerful commentary suddenly stopped. "Rosa," she said, and something in her voice made Rosa's blood run cold. "Rosa, something's wrong with Jason." Rosa turned in the driver's seat to look back at the twins. Emily was pressed against her door, staring at her brother with wide, frightened eyes. Jason was slumped in his seat, his face pale in the glow of the streetlights, his breathing shallow and irregular. As Rosa watched, his eyes rolled back and his body began to convulse in a way that made her heart stop beating. "Pull over," Emily whispered, and then louder, "Rosa, pull over now!" But Rosa was already moving, her hands steady on the wheel, despite the panic fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird. She had seen this once before, years ago, when her nephew had suffered a seizure at a family gathering. She knew that time was everything, that every second could mean the difference between tragedy and salvation. She pulled into the parking lot of a closed restaurant, the car's tires crunching on gravel as she brought them to a stop under a streetlight that cast harsh shadows through the windshield. In the back seat, Jason's convulsions were getting worse, his body rigid with the kind of violent motion that threatened to tear him apart from the inside out. Rosa's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone and dialed 911, but her voice was steady when the dispatcher answered. "I need an ambulance," she said. "A 15-year-old boy is having a seizure. We're in the parking lot of Tony's restaurant on Sheridan Road in Evanston." "Stay calm, ma'am," the dispatcher said. "Help is on the way. Can you tell me how long the seizure has been going on?" Rosa looked at her watch, trying to calculate time that felt like it was moving both too fast and too slow. "About 3 minutes," she said. "Maybe 4. His breathing is very shallow." What happened next would replay in Rosa's memory for the rest of her life, with the kind of crystalline clarity that comes from moments when ordinary time stops and eternity opens up like a flower, blooming and fast forward. She climbed into the backseat of the car, gently repositioning Jason so that his airway was clear, talking to him in the soothing voice she had used to calm his nightmares when he was small. "Está bien, mi amor," she murmured, placing her hand on his forehead. "You're going to be okay. Just breathe. Just keep breathing." Emily was crying now. The kind of terrified sobs that come from watching someone you love slip away from you in real time. "Is he going to die?" she whispered. "Rosa, is my brother going to die?" "No, mi corazón," Rosa said firmly, though her own heart was breaking with fear. "He's not going to die. Not while I'm here, not while we're here together." The seizure seemed to last forever, though Rosa knew from the dispatcher's calm voice that it was actually only lasting the typical few minutes. But when you're watching someone you love struggle for breath, when you're feeling their pulse flutter under your fingertips like the wings of a dying bird, minutes can feel like hours, like years, like entire lifetimes compressed into moments of desperate hope. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the convulsions stopped. Jason's breathing deepened, and his eyes fluttered open, unfocused, but alive. He looked up at Rosa with confusion, his voice barely a whisper when he asked, "What happened?" "You had a seizure, baby," Rosa said, smoothing his hair back from his sweaty forehead. "But you're okay now. The ambulance is coming, and everything's going to be fine." By the time the paramedics arrived, Jason was sitting up, though still pale and shaky. They checked his vital signs, asked Rosa detailed questions about what she had observed, praised her for staying calm and calling for help so quickly. "You probably saved his life," one of them told her as they loaded Jason onto a stretcher. "Quick thinking and staying calm, that's what made the difference." At the hospital, Rosa sat in the waiting room with Emily while doctors ran tests, and Charles caught the first available flight back from New York. The girl had fallen asleep with her head on Rosa's shoulder, exhausted from fear and adrenaline, and Rosa found herself staring at the institutional green walls and thinking about how many times she had imagined this moment, not the crisis, but the aftermath, when she would finally be recognized as the person who had been there when it mattered most. When Charles arrived at the hospital, still wearing his expensive business suit and carrying the leather briefcase that went with him everywhere, Rosa expected gratitude, recognition, perhaps even an acknowledgement of the love that had motivated her quick response to his son's crisis. Instead, she got efficiency. "Thank you for handling this professionally," he said, shaking her hand as if she were a business associate rather than the woman who had spent 10 years loving his children. "I've spoken with the doctors, and they believe this was an isolated incident, possibly brought on by stress or lack of sleep. Jason will be fine." Rosa nodded, swallowing words that tasted like disappointment and hurt. She had expected something more, some recognition that what had happened in that car had been about love, not professional duty. But Charles was already moving on, discussing discharge procedures with nurses and making arrangements for follow-up appointments with specialists whose names Rosa recognized from the society pages of the Chicago Tribune. It was Emily who gave Rosa what her father couldn't. As they walked to the parking garage in the early hours of morning, the girl stopped suddenly and threw her arms around Rosa's waist, hugging her with the fierce intensity of someone who has just realized how much they have to lose. "Thank you," Emily whispered against Rosa's shoulder. "Thank you for saving him. Thank you for being there. Thank you for loving us even when we don't deserve it." Rosa held the girl close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and feeling the steady beat of her heart against her chest. This was what love felt like when it was acknowledged, when it was seen and recognized and valued for what it truly was. It was a moment that would have to sustain her through all the moments when love remained invisible, a secret shared between hearts that beat in rhythm despite all the forces that tried to keep them apart. But even as Rosa held Emily in that parking garage, even as she felt the warmth of recognition flowing between them like light across water, she knew that this moment of acknowledgement was fragile, temporary, subject to the same forces that had kept her love invisible for 10 long years. Charles might be grateful now, in the immediate aftermath of crisis, but gratitude has a way of fading when the danger passes, when life returns to normal and the social structures that govern our world reassert their dominance. Rosa was right to be cautious in her hope. Within weeks of Jason's medical crisis, the household had returned to its familiar rhythms. Charles went back to treating her with polite distance. The children resumed taking her presence for granted, and Rosa found herself once again occupying the invisible spaces between their busy lives. The crisis had revealed her importance, but it hadn't changed her position, and that realization cut deeper than any outright rejection could have. It was during this period of emotional limbo that Rosa made the decision that would change everything. She couldn't continue to love from the margins, couldn't continue to give her whole heart to a situation that would never give her a place to belong. The children were growing up, would soon be leaving for college and adult lives that might not include her at all. Charles had made it clear, both through his words and his continued emotional distance, that she would never be more than an employee in his eyes. On a gray December morning, while Charles was at the office and the twins were at school, Rosa sat down at the kitchen table and wrote her resignation letter. The words came slowly, each one feeling like a small death, but she knew that she had to choose her own dignity over the comfortable suffering of invisible love. "Dear Mr. Whitman," she began, her handwriting careful and clear on the expensive stationery she had found in the household office. "After 10 years of caring for Jason and Emily, I have decided that it is time for me to move on to new challenges and opportunities. I will always treasure the time I have spent as part of your household, and I wish you and your children every happiness in the future." She had written the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it on Charles's desk where he would find it when he returned from his latest business trip. But she hadn't counted on Emily finding it first, hadn't anticipated the explosion of grief and rage that would follow when the girl realized that Rosa was planning to leave. "You can't go!" Emily had screamed, bursting into Rosa's room with the open letter in her hand and tears streaming down her face. "You can't leave us. We need you." "Mi amor," Rosa had said gently, taking the sobbing girl into her arms. "You don't need me anymore. You're growing up, becoming independent. Soon you'll be in college, starting your own life." "But you're our family," Emily had whispered against Rosa's shoulder. "You're more our family than he is. You're the one who's always been there, who's always loved us no matter what. How can you just leave?" It was a question that Rosa couldn't answer, because the truth was too complex and painful for a 15-year-old to understand. How could she explain that love without recognition eventually becomes a kind of slow spiritual death? How could she make Emily understand that staying would mean watching the girl and her brother grow up and away from her, would mean growing old in service to people who would never claim her as their own? But Emily's pain was real and devastating, and it called forth in Rosa the same protective instincts that had guided her for 10 years. She found herself promising to stay, at least until the twins graduated from high school, at least until they were settled and secure and ready for her to step back. It was a promise that felt both like salvation and like a deeper form of imprisonment, but it was also the only choice her heart would allow her to make. The months that followed were marked by a kind of bittersweet intensity, as if all of them knew that their time together was finite and precious. Charles seemed to sense the shift in the household's emotional climate, and while he didn't change his fundamental approach to Rosa's position, he did begin treating her with a kind of distant respect that acknowledged, if not her love, then at least her competence and dedication. Jason's seizure turned out to be an isolated incident, triggered by a combination of stress and the kind of teenage experimentation with energy drinks and too little sleep that doctors assured them was unfortunately common. But the scare had awakened something in the boy, a recognition of his own mortality and fragility that made him more tender toward the people who loved him. He began seeking out Rosa's company in ways he hadn't since he was small. asking her about her childhood in Mexico, about the recipes she had learned from her grandmother, about the dreams she had carried when she first came to America. These conversations felt like gifts to Rosa, precious moments of connection that she stored away in her heart like treasures. Jason had inherited his father's intelligence, but coupled it with an emotional depth that Charles had suppressed in himself. The boy asked questions that cut straight to the heart of things, questions that revealed a wisdom beyond his years and a capacity for empathy that gave Rosa hope for the kind of man he would become. "Do you ever regret not having your own family?" he asked her one afternoon as they worked together in the garden, planting bulbs that would bloom in the spring when he might already be away at college. Rosa was quiet for a long moment, her hands working steadily in the dark earth while she considered how honest she could be with a boy who was still learning how complex love could be. "I did have my own family, mi amor," she said finally. "I had a baby boy once before I came to work for your father. He died when he was very small, and I thought my chance for motherhood died with him." Jason looked up at her with those gray eyes that were so much like his father's, but warmer, more open to pain and possibility. "But then you came here," he said, "and you became our mother instead." The simple truth of it, spoken with such clarity and acceptance, took Rosa's breath away. "See," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I became your mother instead." It was a conversation that would sustain Rosa through the difficult months that followed. As the twins navigated their final year of high school, and Charles became increasingly focused on their college applications and future plans, the house buzzed with the kind of excited energy that comes from impending change, from the understanding that childhood is ending and adult life is about to begin. Rosa watched it all with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, knowing that her role in their lives was becoming smaller, even as her love for them continued to grow. She was the one who drove them to college interviews, who helped them choose which essays to submit with their applications, who held them when they cried about the pressure and uncertainty of growing up. But she was also watching them prepare to leave her behind, to enter a world where nannies and caregivers became fond memories rather than daily presences. The acceptance letters began arriving in March, thick envelopes from prestigious universities that represented doorways into futures Rosa could barely imagine. Jason was accepted to Northwestern, close enough that he could come home for dinner if he wanted to, far enough away that he would have to learn to navigate the world without Rosa's daily guidance. Emily was accepted to Stanford, a distance that would require airplane flights and time zone calculations that would mean months between visits home. Charles was triumphant in a way that Rosa hadn't seen since the early days of his business success. "This represents millions of dollars in future earning potential," he told Rosa one evening, showing her the acceptance letters as if she were a business partner rather than the woman who had helped shape the character and work ethic that had made these acceptances possible. "With degrees from schools like these, they'll have access to opportunities I could never have imagined when I was their age." Rosa nodded and made appropriate responses, but privately she was thinking about different measures of success, about the kind of wealth that couldn't be calculated in dollars or investment portfolios. She was thinking about the way Jason had learned to comfort his sister when she was sad, about Emily's fierce loyalty to people she loved, about the capacity for empathy and kindness that both children had developed despite their privileged circumstances. These were gifts that Rosa had given them, treasures that would serve them far better than any inheritance Charles could leave behind. As graduation approached, Rosa found herself caught between conflicting emotions that threatened to tear her apart. She was proud of the young people Jason and Emily had become, grateful to have played a role in their development, but also grieving the end of the most meaningful chapter of her own life. She was 62 years old, too old to start over with a new family, too young to simply retire into the background and wait for life to end. The graduation ceremony was held on a perfect June morning, the kind of Chicago day when the lake breeze carries the scent of possibilities and the sky stretches endless and blue above the city's gleaming towers. Rosa sat in the section reserved for extended family and household staff, watching as Jason and Emily walked across the stage in their caps and gowns, receiving diplomas that would open doors to futures she could only imagine. She was crying, though she tried to hide her tears behind sunglasses and a tissue that she pressed discreetly to her cheeks. These weren't tears of sadness exactly, but rather tears of completion, the kind of emotion that comes from reaching the end of something beautiful and irreplaceable. She had done what she set out to do 10 years earlier. She had helped raise these children, had given them the love and stability they needed to grow into good and capable human beings. After the ceremony, there was a party at the Whitman mansion, the kind of elegant gathering that Charles organized with the same attention to detail he brought to his business ventures. Caterers filled the grand rooms with gourmet food, servers circulated with champagne and congratulations, and photographers captured moments that would be preserved in albums and digital files for decades to come. Rosa worked during the party, as she always did during family celebrations, helping to coordinate the service and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. But she also found herself observing the celebration from that invisible place she had occupied for so many years, watching the twins receive congratulations from family friends and business associates who spoke to them about their promising futures and the exciting adventures that awaited them at college. It was near the end of the evening, when most of the guests had gone home and the caterers were cleaning up, that Emily found Rosa in the kitchen, wrapping leftover food that would be distributed to household staff and donated to local charities. "Rosa," the girl said, and something in her voice made Rosa look up from the container she was labeling. Emily was still wearing her graduation dress, but her careful makeup was streaked with tears, and her hands were shaking as she held out an envelope, addressed in her careful cursive handwriting. "I wrote you something," Emily said. "I wanted to wait until after the party, when it could just be us. I wanted to tell you what you mean to me, what you've meant to both of us, but I couldn't figure out how to say it out loud." Rosa took the envelope with hands that had begun to tremble, recognizing in Emily's gesture something she had been waiting for without realizing it. Acknowledgement, recognition, the kind of love that isn't afraid to name itself. She opened the envelope carefully, as if it contained something fragile and precious, and unfolded several sheets of paper covered with Emily's flowing handwriting. "Dear Rosa," the letter began, "I don't know how to thank someone for giving me my childhood back, for teaching me how to love without being afraid, for showing me what it means to be brave and kind and strong. You came into our lives when we were broken, when the world felt too big and scary and empty, and you made us feel safe again." Rosa had to stop reading for a moment, the words blurring through tears that she didn't try to hide. In the background, she could hear the sounds of the party winding down, the clink of glasses being cleared, the murmur of voices saying goodbye. But in the kitchen, surrounded by the familiar scents and sounds of the space where she had nurtured this family for 10 years, she felt as if she and Emily existed in a bubble of perfect understanding. The letter continued. "I know Daddy never said it, and I know sometimes we took you for granted, but you were never just our nanny. You were our mother in every way that mattered. You were there for every nightmare, every scraped knee, every broken heart. You taught us how to cook and how to pray and how to find beauty in ordinary moments. You loved us when we were unlovable, and you never asked for anything in return except the chance to keep loving us." By the time Rosa finished reading, both she and Emily were crying openly, holding each other in the warm glow of the kitchen lights while the rest of the house settled into quiet around them. It was a moment of recognition that Rosa had waited 10 years to receive, an acknowledgement that her love had been seen and felt and valued, even when it seemed invisible to the adult world around them. "Thank you, mi amor," Rosa whispered against Emily's hair. "Thank you for seeing me, for loving me back." But even in that moment of perfect connection, Rosa knew that acknowledgement from Emily, precious as it was, couldn't change the fundamental structure of her life or her position in the Whitman household. Charles was already making plans for the empty nest period, talking about downsizing staff and traveling more for business now that the children were grown. Rosa's services would no longer be needed in the same way, and while Charles was too polite to simply fire her outright, she understood that her future in the mansion was limited and uncertain. It was Jason who eventually forced the conversation that had been building for months. 2 weeks after graduation, on a humid July evening when the air conditioning in the mansion provided a cool refuge from the sweltering Chicago summer, he asked his father directly what would happen to Rosa now that he and Emily were leaving for college. Rosa has been part of our family for 10 years, Jason said, his voice carrying a new authority that came from approaching adulthood. She deserves better than just being forgotten now that we don't need a nanny anymore. Charles looked up from the financial reports he had been reviewing, his expression revealing nothing of what he might be thinking. Rosa is a valued employee, he said carefully. I certainly don't intend to simply dismiss her, but the reality is that her primary responsibilities are ending. She'll need to decide what she wants to do with the next phase of her life. What she wants to do, Emily interrupted, her voice rising with the kind of passionate intensity that Rosa recognized from years of watching the girl fight for things she believed in. She wants to be our family. She wants to matter to people who matter to her. But you've spent 10 years treating her like she's invisible. The argument that followed was painful for Rosa to witness, though she understood its necessity. Emily and Jason, armed with the moral clarity of youth and the security of knowing they were loved, demanded that their father recognize what Rosa meant to them and what she deserved after years of devoted service. Charles, defensive and uncomfortable with emotional confrontations, fell back on practical considerations and social conventions that felt increasingly hollow in the face of his children's passionate advocacy. You don't understand the complexities of these relationships, Charles said finally, his voice tight with frustration. Rosa is a wonderful woman, and she's been invaluable to our family. But she's also an employee. There are boundaries, expectations, legal and social structures that govern these kinds of arrangements. Boundaries? Jason's voice was quiet but intense, carrying an undertone of disappointment that Rosa had never heard him direct toward his father before. She held me when I had seizures. She taught Emily how to braid her hair. She's the one who made this house feel like a home after Mom died. What boundaries? The conversation ended without resolution, but it marked a turning point in the family's dynamic that would have consequences none of them could have anticipated. Emily and Jason began treating Rosa with a deliberate, conscious respect that bordered on defiance of their father's emotional distance. They insisted she join them for family dinners, included her in their college preparation activities, and spoke about her to their friends as a cherished family member rather than household staff. Charles watched these developments with visible discomfort, but he also seemed to be wrestling with something deeper than social convention. Rosa began to notice him observing her interactions with the twins with a kind of wistful attention, as if he were trying to understand something that had always been just outside his perception. The breakthrough came in late August, just a week before the twins were scheduled to leave for college. Charles had been working late in his study when he heard Rosa moving around in the kitchen below, preparing meals that Emily and Jason could take with them to their dorms. He found her at the stove, stirring a pot of the Mexican rice that had become one of Jason's favorite comfort foods, and for a moment, he simply stood in the doorway watching her work. "You're going to miss them," he said finally, and Rosa turned to find him watching her with an expression she had never seen before, open, vulnerable, almost seeking. "Yes," Rosa said simply, "I'm going to miss them very much." Charles moved into the kitchen. Pouring himself a glass of water from the pitcher Rosa always kept cold in the refrigerator, and leaned against the counter as if settling in for a conversation he had been avoiding for years. "I've been thinking about what Emily and Jason said," he admitted, "about boundaries, about what you mean to this family." Rosa continued stirring the rice, but her attention was focused entirely on Charles, and the words she sensed were coming, words that might finally bridge the gap that had existed between them for 10 years. When Margaret died, Charles continued, his voice quiet and careful, I thought the safest thing I could do was to keep everyone at arm's length. I thought that if I didn't let myself love too much, if I didn't let the children get too attached to anyone else, we could avoid being hurt again. He paused, running his hand through hair that had gone silver at the temples during the years Rosa had known him, and she could see the effort it took for him to continue. But watching you with Jason and Emily, seeing how they've grown, how they've learned to love and trust and be kind, I realized that I was wrong. I was so afraid of loss that I didn't see what we were gaining. I didn't see that you weren't just taking care of the children. You were healing our entire family. Rosa turned off the burner and turned to face Charles fully, recognizing in this moment the conversation she had imagined having hundreds of times but had never dared to hope would actually occur. His eyes were the same gray they had always been, but they were softer now, more open to possibilities he had been afraid to consider. Rosa, he said, and for the first time in 10 years, he used her name with the kind of warmth that acknowledged her humanity rather than simply her function. I want to ask you to stay, not as an employee, not as hired help. I want you to stay as family. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across a chasm that had seemed unbridgeable, and Rosa felt something in her chest bloom like a flower that had been waiting years for exactly the right conditions to grow. She had imagined this moment so many times that actually living it felt almost surreal, as if she had stepped into a dream she had been afraid to dream too vividly. What does that mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What does it mean to stay as family? Charles smiled, and Rosa realized she had never seen him smile like this before, not the polite social expression he wore for business associates or the careful, fond look he gave his children, but something genuine and unguarded that transformed his entire face. It means your home is here, for as long as you want it to be, he said. It means when the children come home from college, they'll be coming home to you as much as to me. It means when I introduce you to people, I'll introduce you as part of our family, not as our employee. It means, he paused, searching for words to express something he was clearly still learning to understand. It means, I'm sorry it took me 10 years to realize that love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies. Rosa felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but for the first time in years, they were tears of pure joy rather than hidden sorrow. She thought of Miguel, of the baby boy whose death had carved a space in her heart that Jason and Emily had slowly, gently filled. She thought of all the unacknowledged love she had given over the past decade, all the invisible moments that had finally been seen and recognized and valued. Yes, she whispered, and then more firmly, yes, I want to stay. I want to be your family. Charles stepped forward and, for the first time in 10 years, embraced her not as an employer acknowledging good service, but as a man welcoming someone home. Rosa felt the walls she had built around her own heart, walls constructed from years of loving without being claimed, begin to crumble, releasing a flood of emotion that felt like coming alive after living underwater. When Emily and Jason found them in the kitchen an hour later, they were sitting at the table where Rosa had served thousands of meals over the years, talking about practical things like legal documents and financial arrangements, but also about deeper things like forgiveness and the different ways that families can be formed and sustained. The twins' reaction was everything Rosa could have hoped for and more. Emily literally jumped into her arms with a squeal of delight that echoed through the mansion like music, while Jason hugged both her and his father with tears in his eyes and a smile that lit up the room like sunshine. Does this mean we can finally put your picture in the family albums? Emily asked, her voice bright with excitement. Does this mean when people ask about our family, we can talk about all of us instead of pretending you're invisible? Yes, mi amor, Rosa said, smoothing Emily's hair with hands that no longer felt like they were reaching across an unbridgeable distance. It means you can claim me as much as I've always claimed you. The changes that followed were both dramatic and subtle, like watching a house transform as warm light fills rooms that had been dark for years. Charles had legal documents drawn up that formally recognized Rosa as a member of the household with rights and security that extended far beyond employment contracts. He set up a trust fund that would ensure her financial security regardless of what happened to his business ventures or real estate investments, and he began including her in family decisions with the same weight he had always given to his children's opinions. But perhaps more importantly, the emotional atmosphere of the house shifted in ways that were impossible to quantify but unmistakable in their impact. Rosa found herself sitting at the head of the formal dining table rather than eating in the kitchen, found her opinions sought and valued on everything from holiday plans to interior decorating decisions. Charles began asking her about her past, about her family in Mexico, about the dreams she had carried when she first came to America, and he listened to her answers with the kind of attention that honors both the speaker and the story being shared. When Jason and Emily left for college that fall, the goodbyes were different than they would have been just months earlier. Instead of the awkward, painful separation of employee from charges, these were the natural, bittersweet farewells of family members launching into their own adventures while knowing that home would always be there when they needed it. "I love you, Mom," Emily whispered in Rosa's ear as they hugged goodbye at the airport, using a word that had been forbidden for 10 years, but now felt as natural as breathing. "Thank you for never giving up on us, even when we gave up on ourselves." Jason's goodbye was quieter, but no less meaningful. "Take care of Dad," he said with a grin that acknowledged the role reversal they were all still adjusting to. "He's going to need someone to remind him to eat regularly and get enough sleep." And so, Rosa found herself in a position she had never imagined when she first climbed those marble steps 10 years earlier. She was the heart of a family that claimed her openly and proudly, the center around which the Whitman household revolved not out of necessity, but out of love freely given and gratefully received. The months that followed were filled with the kind of ordinary magic that comes from being seen and valued for who you truly are. Charles, released from the emotional constraints he had imposed on himself since Margaret's death, proved to be surprisingly good company. He had a sharp sense of humor that had been hidden underneath layers of grief and fear, and he possessed a genuinely curious mind that found Rosa's stories about her childhood in Guadalajara as fascinating as any business deal he had ever negotiated. They developed routines that felt both comfortable and slightly miraculous to Rosa. Morning coffee shared while reading the newspaper, evening walks around the neighborhood during which Charles would ask her opinion about everything from current events to his children's college experiences, quiet dinners during which they talked about books they were reading or places they might like to travel. When the holidays came, Rosa found herself in charge of decorating and meal planning, not as an employee executing someone else's vision, but as the matriarch of a family creating traditions that reflected all of their backgrounds and preferences. She taught Charles to make tamales, a process that required patience and laughter, and the kind of collaborative intimacy that builds bonds stronger than blood. He insisted on learning her grandmother's recipe for tres leches cake, claiming it was superior to anything his expensive caterers had ever provided. Jason and Emily came home for Thanksgiving, bringing college friends who were welcomed not just as guests, but as extensions of the family Rosa was learning to claim as her own. She watched Charles tell embarrassing stories about the twins' childhood with the kind of paternal pride she had waited years to see, and she contributed her own memories of their growing up years with the authority of someone who had been there for every important moment. It was during Christmas break that Emily made an announcement that brought Rosa's decade-long journey full circle in the most unexpected way. The girl was home from Stanford for 3 weeks, glowing with the confidence that comes from successfully navigating the first semester of college life. When she approached Rosa with the same intensity she had brought to their kitchen conversation after graduation. "I've been thinking," Emily said, settling into the chair beside Rosa's in the living room where they were both working on a jigsaw puzzle of the Chicago skyline. I want to change my major. Rosa looked up from the piece she had been examining, noting the excitement and nervousness in Emily's voice that suggested this was more than a casual academic decision. What do you want to study instead? Early childhood education, Emily said, her words coming out in a rush as if she had been holding them back for weeks. I want to be a teacher, maybe eventually run my own preschool or daycare center. I want to work with children the way you worked with us, the way you made us feel safe and loved and important. The impact of Emily's words hit Rosa like a wave of warm water, filling her with a pride so intense it took her breath away. This beautiful, brilliant girl, who could have chosen any career path, who had the financial security and educational advantages to pursue medicine or law or business, was choosing to follow the path of service and nurturing that Rosa had modeled for her throughout her childhood. Mi amor, Rosa said, reaching over to take Emily's hand. That's the most wonderful news I could imagine. But are you sure? There are so many other opportunities available to you, careers that would be more financially rewarding. Emily squeezed Rosa's hand and smiled with the kind of clarity that comes from understanding your own heart fully. You taught me that the most important rewards can't be measured in dollars, she said. You taught me that loving children, helping them grow and learn and feel secure, that's work that changes the world in ways that matter more than any stock portfolio or business deal. When Charles heard Emily's news, his reaction surprised Rosa with its immediate and enthusiastic support. I think it's perfect, he said, hugging his daughter with obvious pride. You've learned from a master. Rosa raised you and Jason to be strong, confident, caring people. If you can do the same thing for other children, you'll be continuing a legacy that's more valuable than anything I could leave you in my will. As Rosa listened to this conversation, she felt the final piece of her heart's puzzle click into place. The love she had given so freely and faithfully over the past decade wasn't ending with Jason and Emily's departure to college. It was multiplying, spreading outward through the young woman who would carry Rosa's lessons about nurturing and patience and unconditional love into her own career, and eventually, perhaps, into her own family. That night, Rosa stood at her bedroom window looking out over the Chicago skyline that glittered like scattered diamonds against the winter darkness. She thought about the woman who had climbed those mansion steps 10 years earlier, wounded, grieving, carrying the weight of loss but also the capacity for healing love that she hadn't even fully understood. She thought about Miguel, the baby boy whose brief life had taught her that motherhood isn't defined by biology, but by the willingness to love completely and selflessly. She understood now that Miguel's death hadn't ended her opportunity to be a mother. It had prepared her to recognize and embrace the children who would need her love in ways their own circumstances couldn't provide. Charles appeared in the doorway behind her, carrying 2 cups of the herbal tea that had become their nightly ritual. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, offering her a cup and settling into the chair beside the window. "I was thinking about circles," Rosa said, accepting the tea and inhaling its soothing lavender scent. "About how love travels in circles, how it comes back to you in ways you never expect." Charles nodded, understanding immediately what she meant. Emily wanting to work with children, carrying forward what you taught her. And Jason studying pre-med because he wants to help people the way the doctors helped him that night in the car, Rosa added. And you, learning to love openly instead of hiding behind fear. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the lake reflect the city lights like a mirror made of moving water. Finally, Charles spoke again, his voice thoughtful and warm. "I need to tell you something," he said. "When Margaret was dying, she made me promise to make sure Jason and Emily grew up knowing how to love and be loved. I thought I could fulfill that promise by providing for them financially, by giving them opportunities and advantages. But I couldn't give them what they actually needed until you came along." He paused, setting down his cup and turning to look at Rosa directly. "You didn't just take care of my children. You fulfilled my wife's dying wish. You taught them how to love." Rosa felt tears threatening again, but these were the gentle tears of gratitude and completion rather than the bitter tears of unacknowledged sacrifice. She would be proud of them, she said softly. She would be proud of all of us. Yes, Charles agreed. I think she would. As spring arrived and the twins prepared to return to college for their sophomore year, Rosa realized that her life had become something she had never dared to dream it could be. She had a family that claimed her openly and proudly, financial security that freed her from the fear of poverty and old age, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that your love has been seen and valued and will continue to ripple outward through the lives you've touched. But perhaps most importantly, she had something that had been missing from her life since Miguel's death. She had a sense of her own worth that wasn't dependent on other people's recognition or gratitude. The journey from invisible employee to beloved family member had taught her to claim her own value, to understand that her capacity for love and nurturing and healing was a gift that deserved to be honored regardless of who was willing to receive it. On the day Jason and Emily returned to school, Rosa stood with Charles in the driveway watching their car disappear around the corner, and she felt not the crushing loneliness that had marked previous goodbyes, but rather a quiet confidence that this is how families work. They expand and contract, come together and move apart, but the love that connects them remains constant regardless of distance or time. "What shall we do with our empty nest?" Charles asked, putting his arm around Rosa's shoulders in a gesture that had become natural and comfortable over the months of their transformed relationship. Rosa smiled, thinking of all the possibilities that stretched ahead of them. Travel they had discussed, friends she wanted to introduce him to in her old neighborhood, charitable work they could do together. The simple pleasure of building a life based on mutual respect and affection rather than obligation and necessity. "Whatever we want," she said, leaning into his embrace and feeling the truth of those words resonate through her entire being. "We can do whatever we want." And as they walked back into the mansion that had become a true home, Rosa carried with her the knowledge that love, when it's given freely and faithfully, has a way of transforming not just the people who receive it, but the entire world in which it grows. Her decade of invisible sacrifice had become a legacy of visible, lasting change that would ripple through generations in ways she was only beginning to understand. Years later, when Emily opened her own child care center and named it Rosa's Garden, in honor of the woman who had taught her that nurturing children was the most important work in the world, Rosa would understand completely that this was how love multiplies, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through the quiet, daily choice to see and value and care for the hearts that are placed in your keeping. And when Jason, now a pediatric cardiologist, would tell his young patients' families that healing happens not just through medicine, but through love and patience, and the kind of presence that makes frightened children feel safe, Rosa would recognize her own words coming back to her transformed but unmistakable, like seeds she had planted years earlier, finally blooming into flowers she had never imagined. This is what Rosa Martinez learned during her 10 years of loving the Whitman family: that no love is ever truly invisible, no sacrifice ever truly unacknowledged, no heart ever truly alone, as long as it remains open to the possibility that families can be formed not just through blood or marriage, but through the simple revolutionary act of choosing to love and be loved in return. The woman who had once stood on marble steps carrying nothing but her capacity to heal wounded hearts had become the center of a family that would carry her love forward into the world in ways both seen and unseen, both immediate and eternal. And in the end, that multiplication of love, that transformation of invisible service into visible legacy, was worth every moment of pain and doubt and hope that had brought her to this place of belonging. But Rosa's story didn't end with her recognition as family. If anything, it was just beginning. The transformation that had occurred in the Whitman household had awakened something in Rosa that had been dormant for years, the understanding that her capacity for love and nurturing extended far beyond the walls of any single home, no matter how grand or how beloved the family within it might be. It started with small things. When Charles began traveling less for business, choosing to spend more time at home with Rosa, he noticed how she would pause during their evening walks to speak with other nannies and caregivers in the neighborhood. These were women from all over the world, from the Philippines and Ireland, from Mexico and Jamaica, from small towns in Illinois and large cities in California, all of them carrying the same invisible burden that Rosa had carried for so many years. "You see yourself in them," Charles observed one evening as they walked past Washington Square Park, where Rosa had stopped to chat with a young woman from Guatemala who was pushing a stroller containing twin boys who bore no resemblance to her whatsoever. "I see myself as I was," Rosa corrected gently. "I see women who love children that aren't technically theirs, who worry about security and recognition, who wonder if their sacrifice matters to anyone besides the children they care for." Charles was quiet for several blocks, processing this observation. Since Margaret's death, he had lived in such an insulated world of wealth and privilege that he had never considered how many people like Rosa existed, how many women were caring for other people's children while wondering about their own futures, their own worth, their own place in the families they served. "What would help them?" he asked finally, and Rosa was struck by the genuine curiosity in his voice, the same tone he used when he was considering a new business venture or investment opportunity. "Recognition," Rosa said immediately. "Security. The knowledge that their work matters, that they're valued for more than just their ability to keep schedules and prepare meals." That conversation planted a seed that would grow into something neither of them could have anticipated. Charles, who had spent decades building wealth through real estate and investment, began to consider how that wealth might be used to address a problem he had never fully understood. Rosa, who had spent years believing that her experience was unique, began to realize that her journey from invisibility to recognition was something that could potentially be shared with others. The idea came to them simultaneously one morning in early spring as they sat in the kitchen reading the newspaper and drinking the coffee that had become one of their most treasured rituals. Rosa was reading an article about the challenges facing domestic workers in Chicago, issues of fair wages, healthcare access, legal protections, when Charles looked up from the business section and said, "We should start a foundation." "For domestic workers," Rosa said at exactly the same moment, and they stared at each other across the table with the kind of surprised delight that comes from discovering your thoughts have been traveling in the same direction as someone else's. What followed were months of research and planning, of meetings with lawyers and accountants and social workers who helped them understand the complex landscape of domestic employment in America. They discovered statistics that broke Rosa's heart, that millions of women worked in private homes across the country with little legal protection, minimal benefits, and wages that often fell below the federal minimum. They learned about nannies who had worked for families for decades, only to be dismissed without severance when children grew up, about housekeepers who had sacrificed their own family's well-being to care for other people's homes, about caregivers who had given their hearts and souls to children they could never legally claim. But they also discovered organizations and advocates who were working to change these conditions, people who understood that domestic work was real work that deserved dignity and protection. They met with unions and activist groups, with other philanthropists who were interested in supporting workers' rights, with researchers who had documented the economic and social contributions of domestic workers to American society. The Whitman-Martinez Foundation for Domestic Workers was officially established on the 10th anniversary of Rosa's first day in the Whitman household. The name itself was a statement, Rosa's surname paired with Charles's in a way that acknowledged her equal status as founder and visionary. The foundation's mission was comprehensive, addressing not just immediate needs like healthcare and legal aid, but also longer-term issues like education, career advancement, and retirement security for domestic workers. But Rosa insisted that the foundation address something else as well, the emotional and psychological cost of invisible labor, the spiritual toll of loving without recognition. She wanted to create programs that honored the work of caring, that celebrated the women who held families together through their service, that provided community and support for people whose work often isolated them from peers and social connections. The Foundation's first major initiative was a scholarship program for the children of domestic workers, recognition that these women often sacrificed their own families' educational opportunities to support the career advancement of their employers' children. Emily, now in her junior year at Stanford and passionate about her education studies, became involved in designing the program, understanding better than anyone how transformative educational opportunities could be. The second initiative was a series of support groups and networking events for domestic workers themselves, spaces where women like Rosa could share their experiences, their challenges, and their wisdom with others who understood the unique demands of their profession. These gatherings were held in community centers and churches throughout Chicago, and Rosa found herself at the center of conversations that validated years of experiences she had thought were hers alone. "I never knew other people felt this way," said Maria, a housekeeper from El Salvador who had been working for the same family for 15 years. "I thought I was the only one who loved the children I take care of, who worries about what will happen to them when I get old." "You are not alone," Rosa told her, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "None of us are alone." Jason, now in his final year of college and preparing for medical school, began volunteering at health clinics that served domestic workers, understanding through his own experience with Rosa how crucial healthcare access was for people whose work often lacked traditional benefits. He had learned from Rosa's example that healing involved more than just medical treatment. It required seeing and honoring the whole person, recognizing their dignity and worth regardless of their social or economic status. The foundation grew rapidly, funded not just by Charles's wealth, but by donations from other families who had been touched by the work of domestic employees. Some of these donors had experienced their own moments of recognition, their own realizations about the women who had helped raise their children or maintain their homes. Others were motivated by guilt, by the understanding that they had participated in systems that rendered crucial work invisible. But the most meaningful support came from the domestic workers themselves, who donated time and energy and small amounts of money to help their colleagues and peers. Rosa was deeply moved by these contributions, understanding that they represented not just financial support, but community solidarity, the recognition that their shared experiences created bonds that transcended differences in nationality, language, or specific job duties. 2 years after the Foundation's establishment, Rosa found herself standing in the ballroom of one of Chicago's most prestigious hotels, surrounded by hundreds of domestic workers and their families, along with employers and community leaders and advocates from across the region. It was the Foundation's first annual recognition dinner, an event designed to honor the work of caring and to celebrate the contributions of domestic workers to the fabric of American society. Rosa wore a dress that Emily had helped her choose, elegant but not ostentatious, respectful of the occasion, but reflective of her own dignity rather than someone else's wealth. As she looked out at the crowd, she saw faces that told stories similar to her own, women who had loved other people's children, who had maintained other people's homes, who had provided stability and comfort and care while often remaining invisible to the larger world. When Rosa was introduced as the Foundation's co-founder and asked to speak, the applause was thunderous and sustained. These were people who understood recognition when they saw it, who appreciated the significance of seeing someone like themselves honored and celebrated rather than merely acknowledged for their service. 10 years ago, Rosa began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system, I thought that love given without recognition was somehow less valuable than love that was acknowledged and celebrated. I thought that because my work was invisible, it didn't matter as much as work that was seen and appreciated. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces that reflected her own experience back to her. But I learned something during those years of loving children who weren't technically mine, of serving a family that took time to claim me as their own. I learned that love is never truly invisible, that service is never truly unacknowledged, even when the recognition takes years to arrive. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Rosa could see women wiping tears from their eyes, men nodding and understanding, families holding hands as they listened. But I also learned that we don't have to wait for recognition to claim our own worth, Rosa continued, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. We don't have to wait for someone else to tell us that our work matters, that our love counts, that our sacrifice has meaning. We can create community with each other. We can support and celebrate and honor each other. We can make our own love visible. When she finished speaking, the standing ovation lasted for nearly 10 minutes. But what moved Rosa most was not the applause of the crowd, but the sight of Charles standing at his table with tears in his eyes, clapping for the woman who had taught his family how to love, who had taught him how to see work that had always been there, but that he had never fully appreciated. Later that evening, as Rosa and Charles rode home through the quiet streets of Chicago, she reflected on how far they had all traveled from that first meeting in his study 10 years earlier. The man who had once told her that love was a luxury he couldn't afford to let his children experience was now co-chairing a foundation dedicated to honoring the work of love. The children who had been broken by loss had grown into young adults who were committed to healing others, and Rosa herself had transformed from an invisible caregiver into a recognized advocate for others who shared her experience. Margaret would be proud, Charles said quietly as they pulled into the driveway of the mansion that was now truly Rosa's home. Not just of Jason and Emily, but of all of us, of what we've built together. Rosa nodded, understanding that Margaret's death had been the beginning of their story rather than just the tragic event that had brought them together. The woman she had never met had somehow orchestrated, through her absence, a family structure that honored love in all its forms, biological, chosen, earned, and freely given. The years that followed were filled with the kind of satisfaction that comes from work that aligns perfectly with values and experience. The foundation expanded its programs, providing legal aid to domestic workers facing exploitation, offering financial literacy classes to help them plan for retirement, creating networks of support that spanned not just Chicago, but cities across the Midwest. Rosa found herself traveling frequently, speaking at conferences and meetings, consulting with other organizations that wanted to replicate their model. But she always returned home to Charles, to the quiet routines they had built together, to the kitchen where they still made tamales every Christmas, and the living room where they worked jigsaw puzzles on Sunday evenings. Their relationship had evolved into something that satisfied them both, not romantic love, but the deep companionship that comes from sharing purpose and meaning, from building something together that was larger than either of their individual lives. Jason graduated from medical school and began his residency in pediatric cardiology, inspired by his own childhood medical crisis, but motivated by Rosa's example of how healing happens through relationship as much as medical intervention. He often called Rosa for advice about difficult families, about children who were scared or parents who were overwhelmed, and she shared with him the patience and wisdom she had learned through years of caring for people in their most vulnerable moments. Emily completed her degree in early childhood education and spent a year working at an innovative preschool that served primarily the children of domestic workers, a program partially funded by the foundation. She discovered that she had inherited not just Rosa's love of children, but also her ability to create spaces where love could flourish, despite difficult circumstances. The children in her care called her Miss Emily, but Rosa could see that they loved her with the same intensity that Rosa herself had once received from Jason and Emily. As Rosa approached her 70th birthday, she began to think about legacy in ways that went beyond the foundation or the family she had helped to heal. She thought about the thousands of women who worked in private homes across America, who were loving and caring and nurturing in invisible ways, who deserved to have their stories told and their contributions recognized. She decided to write a book. The process of writing forced Rosa to revisit memories she had stored away, to examine experiences she had lived through without fully processing their emotional significance. She wrote about the grief of losing Miguel, about the fear of loving Jason and Emily while not being allowed to claim them, about the slow transformation from employee to family member that had required both patience and courage from everyone involved. But she also wrote about the broader implications of domestic work, about the economic systems that depend on the largely invisible labor of women of color, about the family structures that are sustained by people who are often denied the right to claim family status for themselves. She wrote about the intersection of love and labor, about the way that caring work is simultaneously essential and undervalued in American society. The book, titled Invisible No More, A Journey from Service to Family, was published 3 years later and became an unexpected bestseller. Rosa found herself invited to appear on television talk shows and at literary festivals, asked to speak at universities and policy conferences, recognized as an expert on issues she had lived through but had never imagined discussing in public forums. The attention was overwhelming at first. Rosa, who had spent decades trying to remain invisible, found herself thrust into a kind of visibility that felt both thrilling and terrifying. But she also understood that this platform was an opportunity to amplify the voices and experiences of women who were still living the invisible life she had once known. She used every interview, every speaking engagement, every public appearance to talk not just about her own story, but about the broader need for recognition and support for domestic workers. She shared statistics about wage theft and workplace abuse, highlighted successful organizing efforts by domestic worker unions, and advocated for policy changes that would provide basic labor protections for people working in private homes. But Rosa also used her platform to talk about love, about the way that families are formed and sustained by choice as much as by biology, about the value of caring work that extends far beyond its economic impact, about the possibility of transforming relationships based on power and exploitation into relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The success of the book led to opportunities Rosa had never imagined. She was invited to testify before Congress about domestic worker rights, consulted by other philanthropists who wanted to understand how to support service workers, asked to serve on the boards of organizations working on issues of economic justice and family policy. Each of these opportunities felt like vindication of the love she had given so freely for so many years, recognition that her experience had value beyond the specific family she had served. But they also felt like responsibility, the understanding that her platform came with obligations to use it wisely, to speak for people who hadn't been given the same opportunities for visibility and recognition. On Rosa's 70th birthday, Charles threw a party that filled every room of the mansion with people whose lives had been touched by Rosa's love and advocacy. Jason and Emily were there, of course, now young adults with careers and relationships of their own, but still dependent on Rosa's wisdom and support in the way that grown children always depend on their mothers. The foundation's staff and board were present, along with dozens of domestic workers whose lives had been changed by the programs Rosa had helped to create. But the guest who moved Rosa most was an unexpected one: Maria Santos, the woman Rosa had replaced as the Whitman family's caregiver 10 years earlier. Maria had heard about Rosa's work through the Domestic Worker Network and had traveled from her new home in Arizona to attend the party. "I am so proud of what you built from the love I couldn't give them," Maria told Rosa as they embraced. "You took my failure and turned it into something beautiful, something that helps all of us." Rosa held the older woman close, understanding that Maria's inability to connect with Jason and Emily hadn't been a personal failure, but rather a reflection of circumstances that neither of them had controlled. They were both women who had left their own families behind to care for other people's children, who had navigated the complex emotions of loving without being allowed to claim that love, who had struggled with the invisibility that domestic work imposed. You didn't fail, Rosa told Maria firmly. You did what you could with what you had. We all do what we can with what we have. As the party continued around them, Rosa found herself thinking about the unexpected ways that love travels, how her inability to raise Miguel had prepared her to love Jason and Emily, how her experience of invisible service had equipped her to advocate for others who shared that invisibility, how her acceptance into the Whitman family had given her the platform to expand the definition of family for countless other people. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the caterers had cleaned up, Rosa sat in her living room. She thought of it as hers now, without qualification or apology, surrounded by Charles, Jason, Emily, and Emily's boyfriend, a young man studying social work who was fascinated by Rosa's advocacy and wanted to work with immigrant families concerned with building supportive community networks. "What do you want to do for your next decade?" Emily asked, curled up next to Rosa on the couch with the easy affection of a daughter who had never questioned her right to claim her mother's love. Rosa considered the question seriously. At 70, she had more energy and purpose than she had felt in years. The foundation was thriving. Her book had opened doors to new forms of advocacy, and she had a family that supported and celebrated her work. But she also had a sense of unfinished business, of stories not yet told and communities not yet reached. "I want to go back to Mexico," Rosa said, surprising everyone, including herself, with the clarity of her response. "I want to understand how the experience of women like me, women who leave their families to care for other people's children, affects the communities we come from as well as the families we serve." Charles leaned forward with interest. "Do you think the foundation could expand internationally, address some of these issues from a global perspective?" "I think," Rosa said slowly, "that love and family and caring work are universal human experiences that cross all borders. But I also think that the specific challenges facing domestic workers are different in different places, and we need to understand those differences if we're going to be helpful rather than just well-intentioned." Over the months that followed, Rosa began planning what would become the most ambitious project of her advocacy career, a research initiative that would document the experiences of domestic workers not just in the United States, but in the global network of migration and care work that connected families across continents. She partnered with universities and research organizations, with international human rights groups and domestic worker organizations in other countries to create a comprehensive picture of how women like herself navigated the experience of loving other people's children while being separated from their own families and communities. The research took her to the Philippines, where she met women who worked in Hong Kong and Singapore, while their own children were raised by grandparents and extended family. She traveled to Mexico and Guatemala, interviewing women who sent money home to support families they saw only during brief holiday visits. She visited Canada and Australia, countries with more robust legal protections for domestic workers, but many of the same emotional challenges around recognition and family formation. Everywhere she went, Rosa found versions of her own story. Women who had given years of their lives to caring for other people's children, who had struggled with invisibility and lack of recognition, who had found ways to create family and community despite circumstances that often worked against connection and belonging. But she also found innovations and solutions, examples of families and communities and policy approaches that honored the work of caring and provided genuine support for the women who performed it. The book that emerged from this research, Global Hearts: The Worldwide Experience of Domestic Workers and the Families They Create, was published when Rosa was 73 and became required reading in sociology and women's studies courses around the world. But more importantly, it became a tool for advocacy and organizing, a resource that domestic worker organizations used to argue for policy changes and workplace protections. Rosa's academic success opened even more doors. She was invited to speak at the United Nations about domestic worker rights, consulted by the International Labor Organization about global standards for household workers, and asked to participate in policy discussions with governments around the world. But through all of this international recognition, Rosa never forgot the local community that had nurtured her advocacy. She maintained her involvement with the Chicago Foundation, continued to host support groups for domestic workers in the area, and remained deeply connected to the families and individuals whose lives had been touched by her work. On the 15th anniversary of the foundation, Rosa found herself standing in the same hotel ballroom where she had given her first major speech. But now the audience was 5 times larger and included domestic workers and advocates from around the world. The annual recognition dinner had evolved into an international conference with workshops and panels and networking sessions that connected people across continents and languages. As Rosa looked out at the crowd, she saw faces that reflected not just her own experience, but the full diversity of caring work around the world. There were women from every continent speaking dozens of languages, representing countless different cultures and traditions. But there was also a unity among them, a recognition of shared experience and common purpose that transcended their differences. 15 years ago, Rosa began her keynote address, I believed that love given without recognition was somehow incomplete, that service performed without acknowledgement was less valuable than work that was seen and celebrated. I believed that because I was invisible, my love didn't count as much as love that was witnessed and honored. The audience was silent, the kind of focused attention that comes from people hearing their own experiences reflected in someone else's words. But I have learned that love is never invisible to the people who receive it, Rosa continued. Children know when they are loved, regardless of whether that love comes from someone who shares their biology or their social status. Families know when they are being held together by someone's care and dedication, even if they don't always know how to acknowledge that care appropriately. She paused, looking out at the faces in the audience, seeing recognition and validation reflected back at her. But I have also learned that we cannot wait for recognition to claim our own worth, Rosa said, her voice growing stronger. We cannot depend on other people's acknowledgement to understand the value of what we do. We must create our own communities of recognition, our own networks of support, our own definitions of family and belonging. The standing ovation that followed was not just applause for Rosa's speech, but celebration of a shared understanding that had taken years to build and would take many more years to fully realize. These were people who had claimed their own worth, who had created their own communities, who had transformed their invisible labor into visible advocacy. After the conference, Rosa returned to Chicago with a sense of completion that was different from anything she had experienced before. She had spent 15 years building from her personal experience of invisible love into a global network of recognition and support for people who shared that experience. She had seen her story become part of a larger story, her individual struggle become part of a collective movement for justice and dignity. But as Rosa approached her 75th birthday, she also found herself thinking more and more about the quieter satisfactions of daily life, about the simple pleasure of making breakfast for Charles, or tending the garden where she grew the herbs and vegetables that connected her to her grandmother's recipes. She was ready to step back from the intense travel and public speaking that had characterized her advocacy work, to focus more on the local community and the family relationships that had sustained her through all the years of growth and recognition. Charles, now in his early 70s himself, had been talking about retirement from his business ventures, about wanting to spend more time supporting the foundation's work, but also more time simply enjoying the life they had built together. Jason had completed his medical residency and was establishing his own practice in pediatric cardiology, while Emily had married her social worker boyfriend and was expecting their first child. The prospect of becoming a grandmother, not technically, but in all the ways that mattered, filled Rosa with a joy that felt like the completion of a cycle that had begun with Miguel's death 45 years earlier. The baby Emily was carrying would know Rosa not as hired help or invisible caregiver, but as beloved family, as the woman who had helped raise their mother, as an integral part of their family story from the very beginning. When Emily's daughter was born on a snowy February morning, Rosa was in the delivery room holding Emily's hand, whispering encouragement in Spanish and English, sharing the most intimate moment of family formation with people who had chosen to claim her as their own. The baby, who would be named Margaret Rosa Whitman Chen, in honor of both the grandmother she would never meet and the woman who had helped heal her mother's heart, arrived healthy and beautiful, with Emily's wild curls and her father's gentle eyes. As Rosa held her granddaughter for the first time, she thought about all the children she had loved over the years. Miguel, who had taught her that motherhood was about the willingness to love completely even in the face of loss. Jason and Emily, who had taught her that families can be formed through choice and commitment as much as through blood. And now this new little girl, who would grow up knowing from the very beginning that love comes in many forms and that family is defined by heart rather than biology. "She's perfect," Rosa whispered, and felt the truth of those words resonate through her entire being. This child was perfect, not because she was flawless, but because she was loved completely and without reservation, because she would grow up in a family that had learned to see and value and celebrate love in all its forms. As Rosa looked around the hospital room at Charles and Jason, at Emily and her husband, at the new baby who slept peacefully in her arms, she understood that this was what she had been building toward for all these years. Not just recognition for her own sacrifices, not just advocacy for other women who shared her experience, but the creation of a family structure that could hold and honor love without limits, without conditions, without the artificial boundaries that society often tries to impose on who gets to belong and who gets to be claimed. This is what Rosa Martinez learned during her journey from invisible caregiver to recognized advocate, from employee to family member, from individual struggle to global movement, that love, when it's given freely and received fully, has the power to transform not just the people directly involved, but the entire world in which they live. Her story had become larger than herself, but it had also remained fundamentally personal, rooted in the simple truth that every heart deserves to be seen, every sacrifice deserves to be acknowledged, and every act of love deserves to be honored regardless of the social or economic circumstances in which it's given. And have you ever loved someone who forgot to thank you? Have you ever been the invisible heart that held a family together? Tell me your story in the comments below, because every woman who is loved without recognition deserves to be seen and celebrated. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so it can reach another woman who needs to remember her worth. For more stories that honor the quiet heroes among us, check out our podcast by clicking the link on the left. Until we meet again, remember, your love matters, your sacrifice is seen, and you are never as invisible as you think you are.